Whereas if you have a very tender young green like this and you got mulch over it, that's just the perfect situation for a pest to come in, because a lot of pests are sort of they're light averse. Basically, if the light's shining on them, they know that birds and other predators. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I thought I'd speak to a kind of question I get a lot, and just something I've noticed in the garden when it comes to sowing seeds in a no-till garden, getting things to start growing in a no-till garden. The common wisdom or the common advice you're given, you've got all this, a no-till garden is always covered in a mulch, and you've got 2 or 3 inches of mulch over everything all the time. And so the question is, how do I plant in that? How do I get my seeds started in that? And the advice usually is just push the mulch aside and put the seeds down. And I would say that works. That does work, and I do that. But there's situations where that can cause difficulty, and there's workarounds for that. So I'm going to take you around the garden and show you exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, it comes down to certain kinds of plants that are vulnerable to certain kinds of pests that love mulch. There's maybe a better way or a more reliable way to get your seeds started. So I need to show you this. So let's go have a look here. All right, so here's a bed where you can kind of tell I've pushed the mulch aside and made mounds, right? There's a mound, there's a mound. But as you can tell, the mounds have not stayed where I placed them, because I've got a lot of birds in the garden, and they're basically rooting around, looking for worms and stuff like that. And there we go. And they push the mulch back on top of the seedlings. For some kinds of plants, that's not a big deal, like these parsnips, because they're kind of pest proof. At least I find them to be. Whereas if you have a very tender young green like this and you got mulch over it, that's just the perfect situation for a pest to come in, because a lot of pests are sort of they're light averse. Basically, if the light's shining on them, they know that birds and other predators can see them, and so they're more reluctant to show themselves. Whereas if something's covered, right, they know they're kind of safe, so they can do their thing. But so for plants that really your slugs and snails and things like that just don't seem to bother, like parsnips, just pushing the mulch aside like this is fine. Parsnips are also pretty good at finding their way through. They don't seem to be too bothered. Like some plants get smothered and killed by having this stuff over them, but these plants seem to be pretty, don't seem to mind it. I mean, it's good to come around every couple of days and put everything back in its place, but it's a bit of a pain, but you can work around it. Okay, now let me show you a kind of plant, and look over here. You can't even tell where I mounded up the mulch. The birds have done so much work on this. I still got parsnips. So here's a place where I have not replaced or repositioned the mulch, but you can see the parsnip still poking up through, right? Now let me show you a bed where things have gone very wrong. All right, so here's a bed where I've got these Tokyo, I can't remember what they're called, Tokyo, it's a turnip. I'll put the name up on the screen. I cannot remember what they're called, Tokyo Silk or something like that. Anyway, there's one right there. And if you look, you can see it's just been beat to pieces with, to me that looks like flea beetle damage, right? Now, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had a plastic rectangle, I had one of those things over the bed, and the plants looked great. And then I took it off, and the birds got in here, and they're not after the turnip. They don't care. It's kind of turnip. It's a Brassica, right? The birds don't care about that. My birds, anyway. They're looking for worms and snails and stuff, slugs. So I mean, they're beneficial for the most part. There's a slug right there. Anyway, they kicked up so much of this mulch and covered these turnips, and that just invited every pest in the garden in to go crazy and take them out. So this garden is pretty much a lost cause. And I don't know, I think my April garden tour, I had footage of these, and you can tell they were coming in really good, really strong actually, and now they're basically wrecked. And that's fine because there's so much raspberry coming up. See? Raspberry, raspberry, raspberry. That it would have been difficult to have a Brassica garden here anyway. And these raspberries are just finding their way from the side here, this sort of wild area outside the garden. So I'm actually going to plant potatoes here. It's time to plant potatoes, so might as well get started. So I'm just giving up on this. I mean, you got to do that sometimes, right? But yeah, just pushing the mulch aside to bear a little, reveal a little bit of soil for a Brassica, like a kale, right? Like a broccoli, cauliflower. Especially if you have birds that like to get in there and toss it around and look for stuff underneath it. You run a real risk of the plant being just decimated. I mean, this plant can come back from here. If I really worked at this bed, reseeded some of these, started hitting this with some pyrethrin spray, like something that takes out flea beetles, I could resuscitate these plants and bring them back if I really wanted to. But these raspberries are such a problem. I basically just want to smother the whole bed out. I find planting potatoes is a good way to do that. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now, how do you solve that problem? You do something like this, right? You have cardboard strips and then your bare soil, right? And once the plants get a good height, then you put your mulch in, right? I mean, this is carrot, so it's really not the best example. Let me show you a bed where I've got brassicas, where I've used this approach. All right, so here's a bed where I got some collard greens going. Yeah. And you can see that the collard greens are doing great. And I mean, these are the same family as those turnip, and they are susceptible to pests, very susceptible to pests. But I haven't had anywhere near the problem. I mean, number one, the birds can't get at them because of this, right? Even if this wasn't on there, even if the lid wasn't on there, this isn't what the birds want, right? They like this sort of stuff, right? Because they know there's a worm right there. They know if they poke around and look around, they'll get a nice meal, right? So, they'll tend to leave this alone. Any snail or slug that's brave enough to come out into the open, the bird will pick it off and kill it anyway, right? And of course, you can use a little bit of slug bait. You can see I've got some right there. This lasts a couple weeks actually. The Safer's brand. It's just, every time I mention this, people freak out. Wow, you use chemicals. It's basically an iron pill, right? That's the simplest way I can put it. It's an iron pill. Slug eats it, gets an overdose of iron, dies from that. Just crawls away, stops eating, and dies. And there's a little bit of iron in my garden, which is, there's iron in the garden anyway, right? So it's not a big deal, in my opinion. Anyway, that's the solution. You lay down cardboard, strips of paper, something like that, and you get your stuff growing. Then once it's about 6 inches high, you fill the whole thing with mulch. Just cover the ground, cover everything. Put it right over the paper will just disappear. Now we'll do a contrast here of the same type. So this is a beet garden, and beets I find more pest proof than kale. I got some beets down there. You see they're coming in okay, but I would say in this garden here, and all I did was push the mulch aside, right? And yes, I got a few weeds, not a big deal, right? Come out here one morning and 30 minutes to sort this whole bed out. But some of the beets were just taken out at a very young age. So I would say maybe 30% of the beets in this garden have been taken out by pests. So that's a problem. Now let me show you a very similar garden with the same plant using the other technique, the paper technique. Alright, so here's a garden with beets using the paper technique. And yes, there's some weeds in there, but just generally speaking, the beets are, I mean, I got to do a bit of weeding. There's a bit of lamb's quarters in there, but anyway, the beets are pretty consistently, you know, where they should be. There isn't these big patches of missing beets. I mean, it's not a big deal when that happens, you just replant. But yeah, I don't have these big sections of missing beets in this garden, right? Yeah, so, you know, beet is a lamb's quarters, but right, you can see the beets are very consistently coming along. Nowhere near the issues that I'm having in another bed, because I just took the mulch off, put down strips of paper. Right, it's a little bit more work, but you're saving work in the long run because you're going to have less weeding and less problems with pests, less need to deal with pests, less need to replant, all that sort of stuff. And of course, once they're of a certain height, you're going to cover the whole thing with mulch anyway. So, just a couple tips on, you know, planting seeds in a mulched garden. It's a little bit of work to lay down the strips of paper and weight them down and all that sort of stuff. But I find over the long run it saves time and aggravation. It's totally worth it. It's just it's a question of over time when you're planting, figuring out what plants can just have the mulch pushed aside that are sort of pest proof and which ones can't. For that matter, some plants, they don't even need the mulch really pushed aside that much. They can get up through it, and some can't. Or some plants can get through an inch of mulch, maybe not 2 or 3 inches. Right, like for like a bean, right? A bean can push through an inch of mulch, but I wouldn't, or a pea, something like that. But I wouldn't go much higher than that. If you have a heavy mulch on with a pea, it can find its way up through. But there's a period of time when it's emerged from the soil and it's trying to get through the mulch that it's unbelievably vulnerable to snails and slugs and stuff like that, right? And if you have a no-till garden with a mulch, you're going to have snails and slugs. I mean, they're part of the equation. For my mind, this always comes up, right? The benefits of having the mulch on your bed far outweigh the inconvenience of slugs and snails. For the most part, the slugs and snails they're just part of the ecosystem that breaks things down. And over time, the predator population that helps control them increases. Also, there's only certain plants where they're a problem. They're not a problem for every plant, right? They're a problem for me. The main thing they're a problem for is that whole family of cole crops, the brassicas, right? Crucifers, kale, broccoli, slugs and snails. Everything else I really don't have too much problem with, except squash and cucumbers, when they're really, really little and young, are very vulnerable to slugs. Once they get to that stage where they're putting out their second and third leaves and they're getting spiny, they seem to be slug proof at that point. They're tough and they can just sort of shrug off the slugs, and they have this spiny texture to their stems that seem to hold the slugs off. Well, I think the black flies are telling me it's time to wrap this up, so I'm going to start breathing them in if I stay out here any longer. So anyway, I hope that gave people some food for thought and helped with issues people might be having in their garden, and trying to understand how to make this whole thing work. There's a lot of nuance to it, and there's no one rule for everything that applies. There's certain plants where you can do certain things, and other plants where you got to do other things. I mean, with a potato, I can put a potato on the ground and put the mulch this high, and it just sorts itself out because potatoes are relatively slug proof. Yeah, it's just one of the things you have to work with. For me, the cole crops, right? The crucifers, the brassicas, they're the ones where, if you can just push the mulch aside and plant, I find if it's the kind of mulch the birds are going to pick through and throw around, like if you had a fine layer, let's say an inch of wood chips, then that might be okay, right? But for things like grass and leaves and the sort of stuff I tend to use, because the birds really throw that stuff around, they're going to throw it on top of your tender young plants, and they're going to get brutalized unless you're out in the garden all the time, which I don't like to do. I like to sort of let things. I don't want to work out here. I come out here to have fun. So I find it a lot easier just to put the cardboard down. And I think I've beaten that point to death enough. So I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. And until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.